Hi there, welcome to Bible Slash Chat. Jason, hi.
Hey. What do you want me to do?
I don't know what to do. I just love it. You're like, hey.
I'm not gonna figure.
Just,
I'm gonna be some doofus.
What are you saying? Am I a doofus? Is that what you're saying? That hurts me, Jason.
I'm not gonna be right here.
I'm not gonna be a doofus like you.
No, I'm just kidding.
No. Okay, so
hello.
How are you? I just got dumber.
I know. I'm sorry.
It hurts me.
I'm just messing.
I know. Okay, so we've had today's been a tricky one. We've recorded a few videos, and one of the ones, and we've talked about some things that kind of we had made some errors on and some other stuff, and so one of what we're going to do today is actually a follow-up one from a conversation that we had before.
Yeah, a very controversial issue, and the issue of slavery in the Bible, and how the Bible talks about it, what it doesn't say, what it does say.
Yeah.
And so, especially in America with chattel slavery, race-based chattel slavery as just a huge part of our history.
Yeah.
And that affects and influences how we think about, when we read the Bible, for better or worse, right?
Yeah, totally.
So, as we pick up that question again, what does the Bible have to say about slavery? How, especially certain Old Testament texts that allow it?
Yeah.
So how do we deal with it biblically? Yeah, that question.
So the first thing I would say is, anyone who's listening to this should go back and listen to your very first one. Okay. Because you deal in the New Testament, in that conversation that we were having, you were dealing with the fact that God does prohibit it in other New Testament texts. Right. Which is going to become incredibly important in the near future when we finish talking about some of these Old Testament texts that seem to allow for it. Yeah. But we're not going to get there yet. I think if they go back and listen to that conversation, it's going to be helpful. Okay. What we really want to do here is just deal with some of these texts that seem to offer freedom for the people of Israel to enslave people. Yes. And we're going to break these things down sort of one at a time. The first one is in Deuteronomy chapter 20, and it's under the laws of warfare. Mm-hmm. And what it says is talking about when the people of Israel, they're going to go out and essentially grow the empire of Israel. And when they come to a city, the conquest, they're going to come in, they're going to come to a city, and they're going to offer terms of peace. If the people agree to terms of peace, the text in Deuteronomy 20 says, verse 11, it says, if the city agrees to make peace with you and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. And people say, well, look, God says, essentially, you take your war captives and you can make them slaves. Mm-hmm. The problem is that text doesn't say slavery, right? It's talking about forced labor. What is that? Well, it's essentially the authority of the nation of Israel over those people. So they can tell them, hey, you need to come and serve in various ways, but it doesn't say they're slaves. It's not a specific statement on chattel slavery. Okay. So that text doesn't actually talk about chattel slavery in that sense. We want to sort of take that one off the table and remove it. Okay. It does talk about imperialistic control. Yeah. But again, we would say that's not necessarily wrong. Like to make another city a vassal of the nation of Israel is not necessarily wrong for them to do that. Or even to say in that position of vassal, in that position of submission to us as a nation, you will then, we're going to ask you to come and serve in various ways or pay tribute. That's not necessarily wrong or inherently evil. Yeah. I think most people wouldn't say that it's inherently evil. So that's the first thing. That's the first text I want to look at. Second one is in Leviticus chapter 25, and this is maybe the most complex one. Yeah. In Leviticus 25, you have to remind me which verse.
In the 40s.
Yeah,
44.
40. Is it
As
44?
for your male
thank you.
slaves.
As for your male and female slaves, it says, whom you may have, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. It says, then too, it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land, they also may become your possession. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, but in respect to your countrymen, the slaves of the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. Said like, whew, that's a crazy text because it sounds like chattel slavery, right? It sounds like you can own them permanently, you can bequeath them. That's human property. Yeah. Which initially, when you read that, it sounds that way. Okay. The tricky part is we have to read these in context, not only in the immediate context, but in the broader context. All right. And this is where the text of the Bible actually informs itself. Okay. The people of Israel were allowed to sell themselves into slavery. They were allowed to essentially sell themselves into slavery for the payment of debt. Right. And even as a slave, in the payment of debt, they could say, I choose the life of a slave because my master is so good. I'm going to choose to remain a slave. Yeah. And God says, that's okay if you want to choose to do that. Yeah. The master can choose to receive that person as a slave, and the slave can choose to remain in that position. Okay. Even after they've removed themselves from that.
Paid off
the debt.
Mm-hmm.
And the language in verse 46 where it says, you can use them as permanent slaves, we would say is actually in relation to the fact that they are choosing to remain as slaves with that family. Okay. which would then inform the bequeathing text at the beginning of chapter verse 46.
Okay.
So these are people who are choosing, after having paid off a debt, just like the sons of Israel, to remain as permanent slaves. Okay. Say, well, then why is it only sojourners? And is that like mistreatment? Is that like essentially race-based slavery? Yeah. And this is where it's very important. Leviticus chapter 19, if you just look back at Leviticus chapter 19, in verse 33, it says, when a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Okay. And what is that language telling us? In fact, that's the text that Jesus uses when he says the second great commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. Yep. What is Leviticus 19:33 telling us? It's telling us that the aliens and strangers, whether they're among them or from the outside, what he's saying is you have to treat them like native Jewish people.
Love them.
What does that mean? Yeah. It means you can't enslave them forever. You can't own them as chattel. Right? So that text, Leviticus 19, should inform the way that we read Leviticus 25. Okay. If we take Leviticus 25 out of its context, it sounds like chattel slavery. In isolation. Okay. However, it is not in the same sense chattel slavery as existed in America. Sure. In the early 20th century. Yeah. And I mean, I'm sorry.
No, I know. Until the 20th, until the early 19th century. Yeah.
So that language. So what that's telling us is, God is giving instruction about what slavery should look like for the aliens among the people, but he's giving the exact same language. He's giving the exact same instructions to them as Jewish people. Okay. So people foreigners could choose to sell themselves for the sake of paying off a debt. They could choose to become permanent slaves, and those permanent slaves could then be passed down from generation to generation. Yeah. Same is true of Israelites during that time. Yeah. But those things were by the choice of the individual, as opposed to man stealing, which again we would say is the slavery that was being used in America and which is prohibited in the Bible in the text of 1 Timothy. So that's where we would make a distinction in what the Bible teaches. Okay. Now again, there's one more thing here that's I think important. The language of the text of Scripture sometimes seems to allow for things that it doesn't actually allow for. Okay. What God is actually doing there is he's putting controls on a situation that he knows will take place.
Like slavery.
Slavery, for example. And the clearest example of that is divorce. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, God says you can give your wife a certificate of divorce, and here's the rules that you have to abide by when you divorce your wife. Okay. And you think to yourself, well, is that God saying that he approves of divorce?
Because he's giving
rules about it, right? Yeah. And the answer is no, right? And the way we know that for sure is because the New Testament informs us of that in the Old Testament. Right. And the text that tells us that is Matthew 19. Yeah. And Jesus tells the Jewish people, they come to him and they say, you have the right to, verse 3 of Matthew chapter 19, he said, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? Right? And Jesus says, no, God made marriage and there shouldn't be divorce. Right. And in verse 7, they said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? What are they asking? They're asking the same question as someone might ask about slavery. If Moses said it was okay,
then isn't it okay?
Then isn't it okay? Yeah. And this is amazing. Verse 8, he said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way. In other words, God put rules on the nation of Israel because he knew they would do certain things. Right. And so he put rules in order to protect the victims in those situations.
A woman in this case.
Who would be cast off and then who would be shamed by her husband. And so God says, listen, we're going to protect that woman. We're going to keep her safe. The dowry will be paid back to the father so that she can be provided for. And all these things will keep her safe. But divorce, God hates. Yeah. And so even though he puts rules around it, he doesn't affirm the act itself.
Yeah, like he loves it and he's so great about it.
Exactly. So we would say the exact same thing about slavery. Yeah. There are aspects of slavery that God hates. And we know that because the New Testament informs us of that. Okay. The text that you brought up in the previous video. Yeah. However, knowing that slavery would take place, God puts rules in place that protect the victims in those kinds of situations. And that isn't just for slavery either. There's a lot of other texts, lots of other things that in an ancient Near Eastern culture were permitted, and God knows that those things might take place, and therefore he puts rules to protect the people who are victims in those situations. Yeah.
And I know that thank you so much for that. That's still not going to satisfy some people. You know what I mean? Like, I just was thinking, like, no matter what, if you have a beef with that, you're just still going to have a beef with it. And we can debate about interpretational issues about Old Testament and all of that. It's funny because I've also thought about like polygamy.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
God allows it. Yeah. However you want to use that language. Ordained, allowed, permit. Yeah. He's sovereign over
it. Yeah.
Yeah, and David, Abraham, amongst others, many of the fathers of the faith were polygamists.
Yeah.
And yet...
And he gives rules about what that should look like, and, you know, how you treat the 2 wives or the many wives.
But the intention is monogamy.
Yeah,
and yet, because of the hardness of heart and people's sins in a fallen world, which I think then, if you go even bigger out, is like, how could God be sovereign and good and then allow...
Totally.
Couldn't he have just shut it down and shut this down and done this and done that? And that, all this goes back to that kind of a question.
Yeah, totally.
Like, God's sovereign, but what about all this stuff?
Yeah, and human responsibility in those things, where he's giving direction on what it should look like.
Yeah.
But it's actually a sin that's taking place there. Yeah. And we say, well, at the end of the day, that's the hardness of the human heart. That's the human responsibility that's worked into that.
Right. Rather than turning to God and saying,
how dare you? Yeah. How dare you? Even though, of course, he's sovereign over those things.
Of course.
Which, at the end of the day, brings us back to that mystery.
Which you cannot reconcile up here.
Yeah. And we've talked about that a lot, but I think that's actually the core mystery. And that's actually, what you said there before is so important. That's not going to help anybody. Yeah. Like, we can look at these texts and explain how they fit together in a wider context.
And it's good, but...
It's actually helpful, but as someone who's just out to disprove the Bible, you're going to say, see, there's an immoral thing.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating about that, I was actually talking to one of our interns about this, what's fascinating about that is they're actually using biblical notions of morality to contradict the Bible. Yeah. So, like, well, chattel slavery is evil, but the Bible seems to accept it. Yeah. But the statement, chattel slavery is evil, is actually grounded in Judeo-Christian morality from the New Testament. Yeah. And so they're trying to disprove something using the language of the Bible itself, which is the equivalent of, like, you know, like saying, hey, load that gun, hand it to me, I'm going to shoot you. And that it's irrational, first of all, and secondly, it's actually a broken way to try to understand anything at all.
Very good. Yeah. Very, very good. Well, thank you.
Yes,
that was
anyway,
a lot.
Yeah, lots on that one, but hopefully that's helpful for you. If you look up those texts, I think it might be helpful to just look at them specifically. But if you have any questions or you have other texts that you'd like to talk about, we're always here to talk, so feel free to email us at info@faithbibleoc.org. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon.